Hi, my name is Udi Manor, Ehud Manor, my official name. Ehud is a biblical name, one of the judges, never mind. I'm an Israeli historian. I live in Haifa. I was born in a kibbutz named Nitzanim. It's about 50 kilometers south of Tel Aviv of today. Haifa, everyone knows where is it. And if not, you can Google map it. And in this video, which I don't know would be short or long because I never know how long I will try to explain something. I'll try to tell something about Yigal Allon, one of the most important Israeli leaders ever, that was neglected by very important or so-called important historian. An historian that neglects such a person is not supposed to be considered important, but that's life, you know. Anyway, so officially there are very important historians which had a very long list of students and also PhD students and also people that finally had the opportunity um, to write very nasty views about my work about Yigal Allon. And now the war that started some 14 months ago proved one-to-one any of Allon concepts that were gathered by him and developed by him already in the 1950s and even some of them in the 1940s. Just to who's Yigal Allon anyway? No, you can Wikipedia it, but just a very short CV of Yigal Allon. He was born in Kfar Tavor, which is a very small, used to be a very small place, let's say about 50 kilometers or 40 kilometers to the east from Haifa in the Jezreel Valley, near to the Kinneret Lake. Never mind, look, Google Map it. As I said before, he was born there in 1918. He passed away in 1980 at the age of 61 and something. And he was the most important military leader in the War of 1948, the War of Independence. He was his moves as a commander were decisive in the North Front in May 1948, at the Center Front in July 1948, and then in the South, let's say from October or September 1948 all the way to January 49 or March 49. Later, he became a history student in Oxford. He was seeking at the beginning only, some education. He didn't know a word in English, but after a year became one of the most outstanding students in Oxford. One of his teachers was no less than Sir Isaiah Berlin. Okay, and when he decided to go back to Israel to be part of politics, Isaiah Berlin tried to convince him to develop his what would become a brilliant academic career, but he decided to go into the swamp of Israeli politics. He became minister in 1961, and he was a minister and was part of the most important section of the government, which is the cabinet. It's a combination of, let's say, 5 or 6 or 7 persons. Of course, Prime Minister, the Minister of Defense. 1961, it was one person, Ben Gurion, and then from 1963 to 1969, again, it was one person, Levi Eshkol, never mind, and then other important ministers or like Minister of Economy. But in the case of Yigal Allon, he was part of the cabinet because he was Yigal Allon, not because he had a very important, relatively speaking, role as a minister. So he became one of the most important decision makers in Israel. So from 1961 all the way to 1977, when there was the change, the famous political change, when the right wing managed to build a coalition and Menachem Begin became the prime minister. Yigal Allon was aiming of conquering again or winning again the trust of the labor movement, Labor Party. before the elections of 1981, but he passed, as I said, in February 29th, February 1980. So one of the most important things that he left behind him is, of course, the Allon plan, which is basically a blueprint for strategic concepts of how Israel should use the achievements Israel achieved in 1967, a war that Allon knew in 1958. At least in 1958, he had no doubt that such a war would take place sooner or later. And then in February 1967, he already was talking about the tensions between Israel and its neighbors, and said that if we will have a war, we should change the lots, the territorial lots, so we have what he used to define as defensible borders, a very famous article he published in 1976 when he was a minister for our Israeli foreign minister from 1974 to 1977. He was the foreign minister. So the case for defensible borders, he was publishing this article in Foreign Affairs, no less. So you can check it and read his brilliant concept. So brilliant that, as I said before, very important Israeli historians explained in the half of the biography they wrote about him that Yigal Allon from 1949 to 1980 has no importance because he didn't become prime minister, and he was sort of, in Yiddish we say nebech. He didn't have guts to a kill, as Harold Wilson, his good friend from England, used to say about him, which is true. He wasn't prime minister. He didn't have a gut to a kill. He believed in ethics in politics, God forbid. He was a nice guy, okay? He didn't use his elbows, but he was quite brilliant politician. For historians who deals with history in terms of soccer, who took the cup, who won the cup, and who didn't. So he didn't win the cup, so he doesn't deserve a proper biography. When I wrote my biography about Yigal Allon, publishing it in 2016, a few years later, I also published the English version, which is much shorter, because I felt pity about the English reader that should go all the details that I was putting in my 471 pages version of Hebrew version of Yigal Allon. So the English version, which you can see just behind me, I think one of the books in English behind me. Okay, that's it. Yigal Allon. I moved, so you can see Yigal Allon to a Sussex academic press. If I remember well, it's less than 200 pages. So few years later, one of the pupils of this great historian that explained why Allon is not important wrote about my book, that my book is a piece of crap, so to speak. And then, as I said before, came the war of 2023 and the developments right now in Syria that proved who's the fool and who is less fool, okay? So in my case, maybe I'm the fool, but Allon is less fool than the people that talked about his politics and about his way of thinking as foolish and not important, which prove who they are, who they really are. And don't ask for names. If it's important for you, you can check it. If it's not important for you, don't check it. It's not the point. The point is history. And I belong to those people, those historians who believe that it's not for me to judge in advance before checking the facts if a person is not important because he didn't win Roland Garros or the US Open in tennis. I mean, in tennis terms, only Nadal and Djokovic and Federer are important, and the rest are not important because they are not Federer and Nadal and Djokovic. In history, things tend to be much more complicated, and it's expected from very intelligent people with a very good salary and free parking lot in the academy to use the gift they received from God, which is this, to use their brain. and to judge history on its own merits. So I'm going to go straight to a list of questions that I received from a friend from abroad. Never mind the state, never mind the name. His questions has to do with history, history of Allon, and I'm going to go directly to those questions, trying to give answers as clear as possible. The issue is Allon plan in 1967 during the Six-Day War to take advantage of the crisis, no, because when everything is stable, so you don't move, you don't have too much room to make big changes. But in case that there are some havoc, okay, so to speak, it was a war, full-fledged war between Israel and all its neighbors, and no one knew that it's going to take 6 days. Allon later said that the war should have lasted not more than 4 days because Israel, according to his view, had to conquer all the way to in the north, no, in the front, in the north front, to go all the way from Golan Heights, all the way 100 kilometers from Tiberias to the east, to a place called Sueda. Again, Google map it. It's the capital of the Druze region, and to help the Druze nation, Druze people, Druze sect, Druze, whatever you want to call it. It's not the point. The point is that there are Druze people already 1,000 years, and they have a cultural and social cohesion, and also a political mindset, and they have their own specifics. They yet another minority, one of about 100 different minorities in the Middle East. And the great question of the Middle East is how minorities are getting along together. And the most important thing is what is the attitude of the biggest minority in the Middle East, which is the Arab Sunnites, which is in numbers they are the majority, but in terms of relativity they are another minority, because in terms of humanity they are a minority, because even the Indians today, or the Chinese until 5 years ago, when they were the most populated country, also were minority in terms of in relations to the rest of humanity. So the problem, what makes Europe so a very nice place where most immigrants from Africa or from Asia want to go to Europe and not vice versa, the relation between minorities, which wasn't that great until 1945. Now, as we know, they had 2 world wars. So the issue is how to make a political arrangement that will enhance, or at least create conditions for a lasting peace, and if not lasting peace, at least for a better stability. So this what Allon was thinking about since he was 20-something years old, and in 1948 and in 1949, and then with Isaiah Berlin, and later when he took seminar with Henry Kissinger at Harvard, in the times that Harvard University was a real university and not a concentration place for shitheads. You can quote me on that. I have no problem to say it in their face while spitting in their mouth if needed. Okay, and back then in 1959, Henry Kissinger was running seminars for people from all over the world, from developed countries or remote countries in relation to the US. And this is before he became the great famous Henry Kissinger. And of course, he fell in love with Yigal Allon, his best pupil in this seminar in 1959. So let me go back to Yigal Allon and his Druze state idea. It was part of his understanding that you have to use politics in order to make conditions for a really better world. The way to making better world is not shouting and making manifestations and printing T-shirts with brilliant ideas like queers for Palestine and similar shit ideas like this. And forgive me, the shit, because shit can be used in order to fertilize camps. Not camps, and I'm using Spanish in my head, so I refer to fields. You can use cow shit in order to fertilize fields, so you have a better crop in the next season. If you take great ideas like queers for Palestine, what can you do with it? Otherwise, then tear your hair out and scream, from anyway. So let's go back to Allon, and now I'm going to go from a question to a question and to explain as best as I can what Allon was thinking of in 1967 when he recommended the Israeli government to send the Israeli Defense Forces, IDF, all the way 100 kilometers to the east to help the Druze to build their state, free state. As you know, Israel didn't send the IDF all that way. The IDF stopped 25 kilometers more or less east from Tiberias, or from the Kinneret, from the Lake of Galilee. And the Golan that we know today, which is about 1,000 square kilometers in terms of the US, it's like a very small place. I don't know how to compare it. Only the city of New York has almost 200 square kilometers, so you have a proportion what is 1,000 square kilometers, and part of the population in the Golan Heights of now owned by Israel are Druze. So those Druze right now in this very moment as I speak are in constant contact with their brothers and sisters in Druze land in what used to be Syria until a few days ago. Actually, Syria never existed, only on the map, only as part of the United Nations, only as flag holder in the Olympics, but in terms of, coherence, of political coherence, of nation state, it was always a joke that was on the heads of millions of Syrians oppressed by their different regimes. And it's not the time to talk about the history of Syria, just to give you some background, because Allon knew all about it, because he was Yigal Allon. He was a person that was trying to understand things per se, and not by image and by prejudged prejudice, just like his supposed historians treat him. So the first question is this: was there any action taken to actually try and create one state, Druze state, by Allon? Did he have contact with the Golani Druze about this? How about Israeli Druze? So let's start from the end. Absolutely, yes. Allon was in constant contact with Israeli Druze people, leaders, etc. before 1967, obviously. And in regard to the Druze in the Golan, after the Israeli IDF took control of the Golan Heights in 1967, on June 10th, 1967, of course, Allon made contact with the Golan Druze, and he tried to use not try. He asked them to pass communications to their brothers and sisters in the Druze part in Syria, what they called, and you can see it on the map, Jabal Druze, which means in Arabic the mountain of the Druze, or Druzeland, so to speak. It's an invention it's a word that I invented 3 minutes ago. Never mind, you understand the idea. So the first move that he was trying, that he offered, I said it before, he said, if the Israeli army goes all the way to Jabal Druze, then we can fulfill this idea. Given the fact that the Israeli government decided to not to go all the way to Jabal Druze and to stop only 25, namely about 70 kilometers from Jabal Druze. So the next move that Allon was trying to do is to, through secret channels, through different persons of the Druze ethnicity, living either in Jordan or in Syria or elsewhere, trying to push this idea, knowing that the Syrian regime, after calming down from the defeat in the Six-Day War, will understand that this almost total collapse of the Syrian state will create the conditions that we see in this very moment, that without a strong and oppressive and violent and terrible government sitting in Damascus, run by Alawites, which is the most marginal minority within Syria, and exactly because they are the most marginal minority, they have to be, being in power, they have to be the most violent, which explains the politics of both Assad the father and Assad the son. No, so Allon understood it, and he said, if we're not moving quick, the Assad, the Syrian regime, it was before Assad. Assad was the head of the Air Force back then in 1967, but is other party members of the Ba'ath. And now they will do their best, namely the worst, to oppress any option, any possibility of Druze in the Jabal Druze area to appeal for autonomy or to ask for Israeli help or whatever. Now, second question would be, how involved was Allon in the settlement movement under the labor government? How about in the Golan specifically? So again, I'll start with the latter part of the question, which is very simple to answer. Both parts are very simple, but I'll start with this second part of the question. He was pivot in the Jewish settlement in the Golan. He was in 1967. He was a minister of work. I don't know. It's if of labor. Sorry, not work. I'm translating. You have to excuse me for my limited English. I'm doing my best, and so he was minister of labor, and he was using budgets of his ministry that has nothing to do with direct issues like settlements in occupied, so to speak, occupied territories as part of strategy. It was a question of the government to decide. Allon thought that the government is lingering, yes, no, yes, no, no, yes, yes, no, because it was a very too wide coalition with the right wing and left wing and all sort of left, and also the religious Zionists that back then were very, very moderate. So he understood that if he won't act, things wouldn't be done. So he used budgets of his own ministry in order to help the first pioneers of Jewish settlement in the Golan Heights. Now, as for the involvement of Allon in the settlement movement under the labor governments from 67 and 77, so you have to Wikipedia it, even though it's not perfect entry, but just look anywhere you can find material, also in my book, of course, obviously, the famous Allon Plan. Allon Plan, named after him, obviously, was a combination of a strategic blueprint and also settlement blueprint and also diplomatic blueprint, which was never accepted by the government. It was never part of the government resolution. But Eshkol, the very clever prime minister back then, did it on purpose, because he knew that with this coalition he wouldn't be able to create enough majority to sustain the Allon Plan. So he decided to use the Allon Plan without it being the official policy of the Israeli government, which is very typical of the Mapai, of the Labor Party way of doing things. You know, talk less, do more. So Eshkol was the utmost leader Israeli leader of do less, talk less, do more. You don't rock. I mean, in diplomacy, especially in the Middle East, especially in the time of the Cold War, you don't have to rock the boat. You don't have to ask too many questions because the typical question, the typical answer to this kind of question, are we allowed to build settlement, to establish settlements in the Jordan Valley? Are we allowed, according to international law, blah, 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 yada, yada, yada. So instead of those yada, 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 build, you must establish settlements. So actually, Eshkol was giving Allon the green light unofficially. No, in the case of the Golan, but in the case of the Golan of the Allon plan, which is related to all three sectors of the territories liberated or occupied by Israeli forces in 1967, namely the north, the Golan, and the Jordan Valley that I mentioned before, which means actually the West Bank, and then, of course, the desert of Sinai. In those three cases, Allon concept was very simple. He was talking about two parameters. He used the Latin word, two parameters in Hebrew, of course, parametrim, but he used two parameters. One is the defense necessity, namely, Israel should build settlements in places that, on the one hand, are important in terms of security, and on the other hand, on the same very token, are not densely populated by Arabs. So in case of, let's say, the mountains in the West Bank, which is very important strategically, but they are very populated, very densely populated by Palestinians. So Israel, according to Allon plan from 67 to 77, shouldn't put settlements there. And on the other hand, if in Sinai, in the middle of the desert of Sinai, there's not even one goat, let alone a person, but it's not important in terms of security, so don't build there a settlement because it's a wasting of energy. So according to this Allon plan, the Labor Party, I mean, the Israeli government and the Labor Party from 67 to 77 built no less than 72 settlements, which actually became the consensus in Israeli society, except those that were evacuated in 1982 because of the so-called peace with Egypt. I said so-called because it's not peace. It's an agreement, very important agreement, very important strategically for both countries, but it's not a peace. You can buy in Cairo the protocols of the Elders of Zion and Mein Kampf of Hitler, and most Egyptians think about Jews just like Hamas or just like Hezbollah. In this case, there's not real peace, unfortunately. But again, I'm a slave to facts, not to images, not to preconcepts. Like those famous historians that explain why Allon is so not important. So let's go to question number 3. Were Allon's views, in your view, I mean, my view, an important factor in large part of the alignment not voting against Geula Cohen's law to practically annex the Golan in 1981? Absolutely yes, because as I said before, Allon tried to solve the problem of Israeli defense problems in the north by creating a Druze state, which will be served on the one hand as a political tool for the Druze ethnicity, which he admired. On the other hand, it will be used as a buffer state between Syria and Jordan, because the Syrian regime never really accepted the existence of the Jordan regime. And of course, on the third hand, because I said one hand and second, on the other hand, so I'm coming to the third hand. So this state, the Druze state, will be used as a buffer between Syria regime violent and tyrant regime, and Israel. And so Israel will be alleviated for the problem of Syria that Israel suffered from 1949 all the way to 1967. And of course, Israel suffered from Syrian government in 1948 with the invasion of the Syrian army to the north. So obviously, that Allon concept about the Golan was essential in persuading those Labour Party members that were in 1981 in the opposition to support the de facto annexation law of the Golan in 1981. So, and of course, what I said before about the Allon plan. Number 4, what were Allon's views on the Syrian and Lebanese states? Were they unique in any ways? Okay, so Allon said after the war of the independence in 1948, that in 1949, forgive me, that Israel should have stayed in the Litani, south from the Litani. Amazing, no? Because we're talking about it today, and the so-called ceasefire agreement, which is maybe a ceasefire, but it's not an agreement. It's not an agreement between Israel and Lebanon, because Lebanon doesn't exist today. It's another joke, a sad joke, but a joke nevertheless. It's an agreement between the French government and some members of the American administration, the lame duck American administration, that understanding that both governments in Jerusalem and in Beirut are looking for calming down the aggressions, then yada, 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 yada. Okay, so in Israel, since the beginning of this war, people were talking about the necessity of IDF to control all the area from the Litani River to the south. Surprise, surprise, the not important person, Yigal Allon. No, remember, not important in the eyes of those now prominent Israeli historians, thought so, explained why it should be in 1949. Okay, so in terms of realpolitik, of course, that once Lebanon is a sovereign state, there's nothing you can do about it. But if there is havoc, there is a crisis, you should improve your lots, because the issue is not being okay in the eyes of New York Times or the CNN, which didn't exist in 1967. But there were other sort of CNN, those John Lennons. No, we imagine there's no people, no countries. Make peace, not love, blah, 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 all this crap. Forgive me, what can I do? I'm in favor of peace, but I'm not stupid because I learned history, so I'm trying not to be stupid because I was born stupid, but since I understand that learning history is crucial of being less stupid, I know that the road to peace is not about singing a nice song, filling Wembley Stadium with Bono and U2, and we are the world, we are the. It's very nice. It's very touching. Believe me, even I cry when I say later after I wipe my how do you say it, my tears. I again use the things that are behind my eyes, which is the brain, and then I understand that peace is not about singing and putting t-shirts with queers for Palestine, but doing action that will create conditions that will enhance the options, the opportunity for less war. And then after less war, we have no war. And after no war, we can think about, agreements like between Israel and Egypt. And then maybe 15 years later or 20 years or maybe 100 years later, we can think about peace in terms of European Union, which had two great wars in between 1914 and 1945. So let's take let's learn something from history, no? And then we can sing John Lennon, blah, blah, okay, which is very nice and very touching. So Allon concept about Lebanon and Syria had to do with his main concern, which is the continuation of the Jewish people through Zionism, which means through the Israeli state, which means securing the security of the Israeli state, which means, in his case, defensible borders, which means in 1967, in 1949, that Israel should have been left its army in the south from the Litani, and in 1967 to help the Druze State be created, and if not, at least to make sure that the Golan Heights never will be returned to the non-existent, the bogus state known as Syria. Okay, so yes, Allon, on the one hand, would respect the international order, but on the other hand, all the time had this political math or geopolitics that is necessary in order to secure the future of the Jewish people in the land of Israel. Okay, another question. How did Allon envision Jordan keeping Gaza stable from the other side of land corridor in his plan? Exactly, through a corridor. And the corridor is not a very simple thing to do, but think about it not in terms of Hamas or the PLO. Think about it in terms of, let's be optimistic, no? The Allon plan would be accepted, would be applied also on its political level, which means provisional agreements, temporary agreements, not a peace, Stockholm Nobel Prize sort of peace, which is nothing. Another ceremony, another U2 singing in Bono, singing in Wembley. No, it's another touching ceremony which leads to nothing, like Oslo. No, or the the peace with Egypt, which is not a real peace. Allon was in favor of provisional agreements for 5 or 10 or 15 years in order to create conditions for pacification, which is a process all over the world, also between Germany and England, also between Germany and France, also between Russia and the US, and hopefully between China and Taiwan, and until today, not good enough between Korea and Japan. So people that used to have wars need time and process in order to go to a peace. So peace, it's not a question of making another T-shirt or another a nice song by this or that celeb. So yes, Allon was thinking about a corridor between the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, but given the fact that in those territories, the ruler would be Hussein, King Hussein, which is since 1963 already had a very strong clandestine ties in the field of security with Israel, because both countries had the same enemy, which is the PLO. So in this case, the situation, given those conditions, would be becoming better and better through time. As I said, 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, never mind. I mean, in Middle East, nothing is measured in times of of Twitter, 140, or is it the other Instagram? I don't know nothing about those. Where they oblige me to use only 140 characters to say what I think. I'm talking already, I don't know, more than half an hour, but I'm close to the end. Okay, so the continuation of this question is this. I know he wanted to give it back. Okay, yes, it's true, give it back, but in terms of what would be, who will be in charge in those territories. And again, according to Allon plan, the Jewish settlements for example, in the Jordan Valley, and it was treating the Jordan Valley in the great sense, the big sense of the term, which means, let's say, 10 to 15 kilometers from the Jordan Valley to the west. So this would be part of the security, the defensible borders, as he clarified it already in 1967, and even before, in 1959, the book he published, Curtain of Sand. And of course, in this article that I mentioned before, the case for defensible borders and the way that Israeli government under the Labour Party understood Resolution 242 of the Security Council, which means every Israeli forces have to withdraw from territories, not from the territory, from territories, which means that we can expect border corrections, but not in midget terms, but in substance terms, which secure Israeli borders. So now the last part of this very interesting, very important question: if the PLO were to try to take it over, would Israel intervene? So let's go back to Allon. Allon had a slogan, a very simple slogan. When he was a foreign minister, he used to explain Israeli policy in four words, okay? Palestinians, yes. PLO, no. So simple. On the one hand, we have Palestinians. We have to take their problems into consideration. We have to insist on them taking responsibility, a word that they don't know in any language, responsibility. Always, it's someone's fault. The British, the Jews, the Egyptians, the Saudis, the Americans, the Russians, everyone is to be blamed, except themselves. So, yes, Palestinians exist and they have to take responsibility and be part of the equation, but not the PLO. So who will be the leader, or who will represent the Palestinian case? Of course, Palestinians that sees Hussein and Jordan as their reference, not PLO, and of course not the Hamas, because Hamas wasn't there in 1970, 1972, 1974, and so on. So PLO was a no-no, a big no-no for Allon. So it wasn't a question for him to intervene in case that the PLO would take the territories, but to prevent in advance the possibility that such an organization that is there, it was created only to spread violence, only to ensure the war, the violence and the atrocities and the bad blood between Jews and Palestinians, especially from Palestinians toward Jews, forever. So for Allon, PLO wasn't an option at all. The next question would be, was there anyone in any Arab state who openly supported this plan? Of course not. You should remember the Khartoum resolution of September 1st, 1967, the famous three no's. No to reconciliation with Israel, no to recognition with Israel, of Israel, and no to peace with Israel. So if you don't recognize Israel, obviously that you don't talk about reconciliation or no, not reconciliation, sorry, negotiation. No, no recognition, no negotiation, and not peace with Israel. Of course, another brilliant historian, in this time from Oxford, explained why this resolution took in Khartoum in September 1st, 1967, was the triumph of the moderate side in the Arab League. And of course, he blamed in his book about Hussein. You can check who wrote, which Oxford historian wrote a book about Hussein. I think in the Israeli version, it's in page 25, is blaming the propaganda machine of Israel of using the Khartoum resolution as part of its resentment of peace. Now, look, we're talking today not only about Allon, but about brilliant historians, one from Tel Aviv and the other one from Oxford, no, the mecca of common sense, no, of the brain. Okay, so there you have, okay, another brilliant historian that presents the no, no, no of Khartoum as the triumph of moderation within Arab world and as part of the Israeli propaganda machine against peace. Because as you know, Israel is the problem in order to have peace. Of course, no Arab country would openly adopt or support or endorse a Allon plan. And of course, this the same historian that I mentioned before. He gladly writes with so much euphoria and enthusiasm that Hussein, when he heard about the plan, said it's totally unacceptable. Of course, it's totally unacceptable because it means that Jordan would be the first country to negotiate land to Israel, and Jordan, which was in the eyes of the Arab world, was the traitor, was part of colonialism. No? So how one would expect, only if you are a very brilliant historian from Oxford, then you expect that Hussein should really take into consideration the option of openly or covertly endorsing Allon plan. Of course, he totally unaccepted it, and Allon knew that he totally unaccepted. But in the real world of not the T-shirts and historians in Oxford and Tel Aviv or Wembley with Bono, in the real world, Hussein was all the time in constant contact with the Israeli government, which saved both his regime and his ass in September 1970, which we know as the name of the Black September, this great organization that killed Israeli sportsmen in Munich. You have those Che Guevaras, those revolutionaries, queers for, okay, so we have this virgin 1972. They massacred sports athletes in Munich. Wow, amazing, no? And of course, there were people that were applauding them, no? Back then, just like shitheads today applauded the Hamas, slaying babies and kidnapping whole families and etc. No, so Black September was black for the PLO, but it was a pink September both for Hussein, especially for Hussein, because his ass was saved and his regime and his state. Okay, and he long lived happily ever after until 1999. So do the math. Okay, so Israeli actually alone gave him 29 years. More than he had, because Allon didn't enjoy longevity. So on the one hand, you have totally unacceptable, as this great Oxford historian would explain to you. And in the real world, which is the realm where a proper historian should put his focus on, Israel and Jordan kept with their, let's say, coordination in terms of the better option for both countries, which meant that both countries had to fight the same enemy, which is the PLO. So I think that's the last question. What did Allon think of unilaterally annexing land he thought Israel should keep without a full peace deal? Exactly that. But without saying the annex, the F word or the A word, without declaring it. I mean, Allon understood that the Middle East, not only the Middle East, the whole humanity works like this. Okay, the fact that there is an existing and very known, very well marked border between Mexico and the US doesn't mean that there are many Mexicans that remember that the US stole from Mexico with a very nasty manipulation, millions of square kilometers back then in the 1830s and 40s. So, and Russia today in Ukraine, and China with Taiwan, and etc., etc. So nothing is steady in the history of humanity. But let's say that relatively, since let's say 1648, they were created this Westphalia concept that states should recognize the sovereignty of the next state, and the state, hence, the state should have a mark on the map their borders. Okay, but in the Middle East, it's not functioning. You can see it in Syria, you can see it in Iraq, and you will see it in Iran, that will collapse sooner than later. It's another artificial nation state, even though the Persian ethnicity is real. But I'm talking about the borders, the limits, okay? And if it was up to the Russian Empire in the 19th century, the borders of Iran were different today. So let's go back to Jordan and Syria and Lebanon, which are the relevant territories in terms of Israel. So Allon said, yes, the most important thing in order to ensure, so to speak, I mean, relatively ensure, because nothing, you don't have, it's not satisfaction guarantee, and you don't bring back the commodity after, like the people that buy clothes before wedding, and then they return it, because in the US, shopkeepers are so in favor of the client, so a client can cheat them, use the suit for one night and then give it back, and he didn't have to pay. So nothing works in those terms. I mean, nothing can ensure 100% the security of Israel, but you can make better conditions to enhance the chances. So part of those conditions for Allon, the most important thing, and it's the 10th time that I'm saying it, it's defensible borders. So in case that on the other side would be people like regimes like Syria, so Allon actually he suggested to annex the Golan Heights in 1967. He was the first to talk about annexation of the Golan already in 1967. And the Eshkol, the prime minister, was very prudent, because he didn't know how the Americans would react, the Cold War, Vietnam, etc., and the Russians, etc. So he said, no, we will not make big declarations, no annexation. We just build our settlements, and we won't move from there. And this what happened. This what finally happened. And the same applies to the case of the Jordan Valley. And unfortunately, it wasn't applied good enough in the case of the settlements, Jewish settlements in the southern part of the Gaza Strip, because you can say, people say you don't ask if in history. Of course you ask if in history. There is a special there's special concept for it, contrafactual history, which means that you take one element or two elements from a known history and you change it, and then you try to guess what would happen. Okay, so for example, if there weren't trains in the US and in 19th century, and the commerce would have been relying only on canals, would the American economy got better, worse, or the same? So the people are making calculation, and they're arriving to the conclusion that the economy would shrink in 1%, which means that the railway was more a political thing for the robber barons than to American commerce. So the same applies, the same technique, the same way of thinking can be applied here. If settlements that were pushed forward by Allon Plan in the 1970s were still in place in 2023, not only that Hamas wouldn't be part of the equation, not only that the massacres of 2020, October 23, wouldn't be happening, most likely that the peace with Egypt would be much better in terms of European peace or South American peace. or American-Canadian peace, okay? And you can go on with your own examples, which aren't, because those are the examples of real peace, okay? A cordial peace between nations, between countries. And unfortunately, the irony is that the right-wing government led by Menachem Begin, okay, and with the foreign minister, which was the nemesis of Yigal Allon, Moshe Dayan, that was part of the Labour Party, that was adored by many, many Israelis, including many, many historians. Maybe this is the explanation why Dayan received so much attention, while Allon, his biography was neglected. Okay, so we have another irony to close this long session. And only under the nemesis of Allon, he was replaced by his nemesis in 1977 in the foreign ministry, Israel made this huge, this colossal mistake, which, as I explained in my book, it wasn't a mistake in the eyes of Dayan, and I don't want to go into it, but for Begin, it was a mistake because he thought that if he's giving up all the desert of Sinai, the international community would tell him that he doesn't have to do anything about the West Bank. In fact, he was creating the precedent. No, if you returned all Sinai, you have to return all the Golan and all the West Bank. Okay, so it was a big mistake made by a romantic leader, which wasn't using his world, his God gifted, gift, his brain in this case, because otherwise he was a very clever person. And the result was the evacuation of Jewish settlements set forward by the Labour Party under the spell of the Allon plan. So unless there is another question, and there isn't, so I thank you so much for listening, for suffering this long talk. I hope you not enjoy. We're talking about history. What it's to enjoy? It's not pizza, not an hamburger, not orange. I have to respect also the vegetarian among us that are enjoying vegetables and cucumbers, which I do, but also pizza and hamburger. So I hope you learned something. This is the important thing, and I hope you didn't take too bad my inclination to raise my voice and to use wrong words. I don't really give a damn if you didn't, because that's me. And the important thing about what I'm doing is that I'm trying to produce history as best as I can. And my way of doing it is looking at reality as is, no, without preconcept, without prejudices, without thinking about my next conference and my next invitation to this or that gala and all that jazz. Okay, thank you so much. If you have any question, you can email me. My email is UDIMANOR, Udi Manor. This is my name and my nickname. My name is Ehud Manor, but my nickname, I go by Udi. So Udi Manor in one word, UDIMANOR @gmail.com. How original it can be, no? Thank you so much. Bye-bye.